Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's keeping safe in this extraordinary times. I'm just going to spend about 20 minutes to something that we do regularly to DHL customers on, how do we handle customs clearance? Because if you're selling internationally, the obvious bottleneck is are the customs authorities of both the export and the import countries, right? So I'm going to give some basics as to what you guys should know about customs clearance, because at the end of the day, what you want is to secure your supply chain at the end of the day, right? You want to have continued access to to those key markets that you've been selling your products to. So the first thing I'll start off is how is B2C or e-commerce very different from the traditional import channels, right? Obviously, in the traditional channels, you have the B2B, right, where there's a business overseas that sells to an importer with another business who then sells locally to a customer. With an e-commerce situation, the supply chain looks somewhat, quite different, which has implications from a customer's perspective. So it's basically business directly to customer, right? And then you have in between, some of you may have a site, either a third party or your own site, right? How does then this change the way one manages a supply chain in an international context, right? So in a traditional context, right, some of you may be familiar with Incoterms. These are called international commercial terms. They are done by the International Chamber of Commerce, right? In a traditional context, you have, various types of Incoterms, right? Ex Works, FOB, you have DDP or DAP, right? Which is delivered duty paid or delivered at place. And the Incoterms basically tell you the responsibility of the party for the shipment in the international supply chain. In the case of Ex Works, FOB, CIF, or DAP, DDP, the overseas business, the seller, right, usually has control of the shipment in the case of Ex Works up to the point where the shipment leaves their own premises, right? In the case of DDP, they have control of the shipment up to the point where the business on the import side is importing, right? So basically, Incoterms tells you who is responsible and who is liable for damage, right? If there's damage that's going on that occurs to the shipment, midway in international waters, who pays for it, right? And then it indicates also what the end customer sees, right? In the case of this case, B2B for a DDP shipment, for example, the end customer just sees a shipment at the doorstep. They don't handle anything to do with the international waters, the customs clearance, and so on and so forth, right? So that's a traditional B2B. Now, this is quite important because in the B2C situation, it is quite different, right? In most cases, I wouldn't say in all cases, in most cases for a B2C, the seller basically controls the supply chain all the way to the doorstep of your customer. So for example, you don't require your customer to go and collect the item from the port or the airport and clear customs themselves, prepare the declarations, pay the duties and taxes. You may in some countries, but generally speaking, because you want a positive customer experience, right? Most sellers would sell at DAP or DDP, which means we will deliver it duty paid, right? All inclusive. So this is quite critical from an e-commerce, from B2C perspective, because it has implications on your business, right? The first thing it does is it means that your price needs to include all duties and taxes and other charges along the supply chain, right? And there are other charges, right? So you need an all-inclusive pricing, or sometimes we call it a fully costed price, right? And if you want your shipments to go to access a market quickly, you need to factor into account the complexity of customs clearance in a specific country, right? In order then to guarantee certain types of times to deliver your shipment, right? And then you also need to factor in for those countries. Is it easy to do returns? Is it easy to get a refund on your duties and taxes, right? And in some countries, of course, depending on the products that you sell, you may need certain types of licenses and permits. For example, now, with the masks and the PPEs that are being sold online, right? Some countries, the Food and Drug Administration or Ministry of Health is saying, you need a license to import some of these, for example, right? So it has implications. And then, of course, if you're selling very, very high valued items, right, the customs clearance is a little bit different from a low value item. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. Because the more high value it is, the more information you need to provide with customs, because there are duty implications, right? And then, of course, understanding the local knowledge, local market is important, particularly in the more challenging market that you wish to sell in. So a reliable logistics is important as well. So because the seller controls the entire supply chain, right, up to the consumer, the business in a B2C situation, these are some of the things that you probably do need to take into account in order to be successful when you're trying to sell overseas, right? So what I thought I'll do, right, is when we talk about all-inclusive pricing, how do you know how much to add to your price in order for you to sell internationally and in order to have a fully costed price? So what I thought I'd do is I quickly take you through the basics of import and export, right? So there are really 4 things you just need to remember when you're doing import and exports, right? There's classification, there's valuation, de minimis, and then what I call put into other factors, factors bucket, right? These 4 items will determine how much duties and taxes should be paid, what kind of paperwork, and how fast you can clear your shipment, right? And I'll very briefly explain them in turn, okay? So classification. Classification actually is the way customs defines a shipment so that they can apply a duty rate. Some of you may have heard of this thing called the HS codes, the harmonized system codes, right? So if you're importing maybe a mobile phone into a country, or you're selling a mobile phone across borders to another country, right? There is a specific code that is attached to that. And if it's that code, there is a specific duty payment, right? Now, how do you determine what is the right classification, right? It's very simple. At its most basic level, you ask what is the essential characteristic of the good. In the case of a mobile phone, it's a mobile phone, right? So you look for maybe telecommunication devices or mobile phones or what have you, right? But one thing to note is that the HS code differs from country to country. They are not the same. Each country has a different HS code, and of course, attached to that code, a different duty rate. Okay, if you are selling into country A with a specific HS code with this duty rate, don't assume it's the same in another country. It may be the same, it may not be the same. Okay, so I just want to give you an example of a slight complexity and why it is different, right? So this is an example of a men's shirt, and this is going into Japan actually. In Japan, there are 2 possible classifications. One is 10.9% and one is 7.4%, different types of HS codes, right? And to determine what is the right classification for this shirt, right? The rules actually will tell you, right? Is the difference whether the material is knitted or whether it's crocheted, right? If it's knitted, it's one HS code. If it's crocheted, it could be something else, right? So it is slightly technical, but don't worry. What you do need to understand is that HS codes are required. They're based on what is the essential characteristic, and they differ from country. We have this thing which called DHL.com. It's free. You can go on to it. It's called Trade Automation Services, right? And in that, that's the thing we call Global Trade Services. If you log in, you basically can register for free, and there is an access which gives you access to the HS codes for all the almost all, I think, the countries in the world, right? You can key in a keyword, and then it comes up with basically possible classifications, and you can pick what you think is the closest in terms of description. All right. So Trade Automation Services at DHL.com. But it's something that you as a seller need to know and not assume, right, that the broker will know, right, or the logistics provider will know, because sometimes the shipment, the product that you are selling may be so specific that not everyone has knowledge of the technicalities of the product. Okay. So that's classification. Then the second one is the value, the customs value, right? Now, do know that there are international rules on what is the right customs value to use. Okay, it's under the World Trade Organization customs valuation rules, and majority of the countries globally who are members of the WTO, which is almost all, right, barring North Korea, I think, are members of the WTO and have to subscribe to this method of customs valuation. And it's very simple, very straightforward, okay, for a B2C case. it's the invoice price. That is the price that is the basis for the customs value. And in the technical word is what is the price that was actually paid, right? The transaction value, right? And so if a discount was provided, obviously a discount is recognized, right? Because the actual, if you were selling at $10, you gave a discount of 20%, the buyer only buys at $8, right? Then obviously $8 is the transaction value, okay? And that's the value for customs purposes, and the value in which you calculate your duties and taxes, okay? Now, one thing I'll have to say though is that valuation, we've seen a lot of cases in e-commerce where, of course, people try to under-declare in the invoice, and they do what I call double invoicing, right? So the invoice that accompanies one shipment, right, is less than the actual payment and the actual invoice, which usually they send by email or some other means, right? And so just be very careful that customs is onto this, right? And in many countries now, actually, even in Europe, in the US, they are stopping shipments and demanding proof of payment. You know, if you say this is declared at $8, show me your credit card slips, show me your bank statements to show that this was the actual amount you paid, right? So yes, it is being looked at by customs authorities, right? But just do know that, you know, if you are declaring at the right amount, that the transaction value, the price paid or payable, you are fine. So let me just give you an example here, like with ink cartridges, right? So in case of ink cartridges, if you buy it on an e-marketplace, let's say it's $15. But if someone buys it from a supplier, it's $9, right? So you have two different prices for the same product. So what is the right customs value? Under WTO rules, right? Both values are acceptable because what is the actual amount that you pay? So if someone bought through an e-marketplace and paid $15 for a print cartridge, right? That's the price. If someone bought from an ink supplier who then supplied this overseas and paid only $9, then that's the price, right? So in either case, you know, you're fine. But WTO rules basically are quite clear for a traditional B2C type, you know, model, and it's pretty straightforward actually. All right. And then, of course, the third element for import and export is de minimis, right? What is the de minimis? And just so that you all know, the de minimis is the threshold, the value below which you don't pay any duties and taxes, okay? And generally speaking, it is simpler and faster types of clearances, right? So in the case of Singapore, if you're buying online, and you're importing into Singapore, is 400 Sing dollars. Anything below 400 Sing dollars is GST free, right? Now, do note that the threshold value differs from country to country. Singapore, it's $400. In the US, it's $800. In Australia, it's 1,000 Aussie dollars, right? In Thailand, it's 1,500 baht. You know, it differs from country to country, right? And there are certain specifics. You know, in some countries like Australia now, they charge GST on it, right? In some other countries, duties and taxes and GST are all exempt, right? But generally, the de minimis allows, obviously you can see that a lot more e-commerce shipments being low value, right? Mostly fall under the de minimis, and a lot of them get cleared, you know, quicker, you know, with less requirements and without the need for the payment of duties and taxes, right? But one thing I must emphasize, right, is that if your item requires a license, so for example, if you're sending face masks to Thailand, which requires an FDA license, and even if that mask is below $1,500, you cannot clear as de minimis. Anything that is a control item, we say, cannot be cleared as de minimis, and duties and taxes will be applied to them, okay? So note that the thresholds are different. So what are the thresholds like, right? You know, look at the differences here. You know, you have US, Philippines very recently increased their de minimis to 10,000 pesos, which is actually quite high. You know, Indonesia just had theirs reduced to $3, which is really quite low. And Europe is about 22 euros, right, for a de minimis. Once, as I mentioned before, ensure you are up to date as to what are the latest de minimis amounts. You can get them from your DHL broker, or you can even get them, Google that online just to find what the de minimis thresholds are, okay? So that's the third area for de minimis. And of course, the fourth area for import and export is what I call other factors, right? Other factors are things like, you may require a license. In some cases, you may need to, as an importer, you may need to register. So if you are, for example, in India and you're buying online, right? All people buying online need to provide KYC, know your customer, a bit like what you do when you open a bank account, right? KYC documentation to the broker or the agent, right? It's just because the way the country has regulated e-commerce clearances, right? In some countries, you may have other additional customs charge. In the case of Philippines, for example, there's a charge for certain types of formal clearances that's over and above the duties and taxes. Okay. So what I would say is you need to factor some of these complexities in. Your broker or your logistics provider, whoever, should be able to provide you with some information, so you roughly know, how complex are some of the markets that you are selling into. Okay. So with those 4 items, right, I thought I'd just give you an example. If I think it's important as the seller, because you control the supply chain, you control access to the markets. You want control access to the markets, right? If you're selling DDP or delivered duty paid or delivered at place, right? You kind of want to know, like, roughly what is the trade landscape for your shipments, your products. So like fashion items, right? I just picked this up, based on some of the fashion customers with DHL, right? If you're selling apparel, jewelry, etc., I just picked some range of HS codes, right? And like apparel, the duty rates range from 0% in Malaysia to up to about 35% in Brazil, right? And there are very specific for some types of countries, depending on your market, right? You may need certain labeling or marking requirements, and so on and so forth, right? It'd be good sometimes just to get an idea and a sense of the trade landscape for your major items and your major markets. You don't have to do it for every single SKU. You don't have to do it for every single market. Pick your major markets, pick your major product groups, right? And just get a sense, so you roughly then know how to, what are the regulatory requirements that may need to be done ahead of time, or even what are the duties and taxes that you may need to incorporate into your pricing. Okay. And then things like high tech, computers, CPUs, and so on and so forth. I just picked another sector as an example. These are also what we see a lot that's moving online, right? Through B2C channels. So that's the basics for import and export, right? The 4 major building blocks, right? And I thought I'd just try to give you an idea. What is the customs environment globally? What is the regulatory environment, so that you understand, customs officers are usually not the most friendly, right? And not the most accessible of organizations, right? And so I think it's important to understand what are they like, because they impact your supply chain, right? For Asia, revenue is still the main KPI for customs, right? They have revenue KPIs. They are literally a tax collector. Okay. So, for customers who complain why shipments take so long to clear, it's a very simple answer. It's because customs are trying to get as maximum revenue as they can, right? They do have KPIs. And if you actually walk into some customs offices, you see on the boards, right, there are targets, revenue targets given to them, not by themselves, but the Minister of Finance, right? So revenue is a main driver, and you get very many different levels of modernization, right? You have Australia on the one hand, you have Cambodia, Laos on the other hand, very vast differences in Asia, right? And so, sometimes things are not the most transparent. There are a lot of gray practices on the ground, right? And sometimes if there's a new rule, they don't tell you in advance. It comes out today and it needs to be implemented immediately, right? So this is the challenge that, one faces when you're selling into Asian markets. What about the EU and the US? It's slightly, understandably, for EU and the US, the focus is not so much revenue. It's more security and safety, right? And you can understand this like from the US perspective on the 9/11, right? Customs is now the main, and Homeland Security, CBP, right? They call it Customs Border Patrol, right? Is the main, interface before anything gets into the country. So the focus is really very much on terrorism, on making sure, that terrorists or whatever types of restricted individuals are not sending stuff to the US, that you're not sending something that is going to impact the society, right? And so that is the main focus. And revenue is important, but it's secondary. Okay, so they focus a lot more on compliance with safety and security issues. Okay, so that's the difference roughly between Asia and the EU and the US. But what about the nature of customs clearance? And this to me applies across the board. I think it's very important, right, to understand that the customs treatment in one country is not the same as another country. Okay, and this is important because we have had customers complain to us, oh, I can clear this in Japan. How come I can't clear it the same way in the Philippines, for example? Very simple. They're just different countries, different regulations, right? And then the customs treatment also may change over time in the same country. So there are some customers who tell us, oh, I've been importing this in the past with no problem. How come when I import it now, there's a problem, right? And it's simple. The regulations may have changed, customs risk profile may have changed. They may think that certain type things are a little bit more high risk, or they are this distinct operation. You know, remember, they are there to protect the borders, they're there to collect the revenue, right? And of course, the other thing with customs clearance is that for your responsibility to comply with local regulations, right? It doesn't apply just to existing shipments. So I give you an example, right? If a shipment is cleared today, you buy something in the import and clear today, right? You say, fine, no problem, it's cleared, I am no longer liable, right? But note that under customs law, same thing with tax law, there is a period of time where you are liable. And in some countries, it goes up to 10 years. So you could be getting customers knocking on your door, 10 years after you imported something and say, oh, you imported this 10 years ago and we discovered some fraud, for example, right? So just note that, a bit like your income tax, right? Customs is, as a tax collector, also has that kind of what we call statute of limitation provisions under the law, right? So, so these are some of the things about customs clearance, right? But there is a specific thing that I want to highlight about e-commerce, okay? Because e-commerce has only been ongoing for the last few years, right? And to just to let you know, based on our discussions with customs, right, it is challenging for customs to control because you are getting significant amounts of small parcels coming in. Customs only has a limited manpower, and if their role is to collect taxes and to protect the society, right, it's going to be a nightmare for them. Imagine if they receive 50,000 shipments daily to process, right? And with B2C also, it's very hard for customs officers to go after the receiver, whoever's receiving the shipment, because they can't go after the overseas seller, right? If there's a non-compliance or some fraud involved, right? Because there are thousands of them in an e-commerce channel, right? And customs just generally views e-commerce as very bad for smuggling, revenue leakage, and so on and so forth. And they are also facing local pressures by retail stores, right? That this is, e-commerce is very unfair. We need to protect the retailers locally, the brick and mortar stores, right? And so you need to restrict the import of e-commerce shipments, right? And so this is the challenge that we face. There are two different groups, right? One is those who are pushing for e-commerce globally, and there's customs here who are saying, no, this is, overwhelming. It's a tsunami, basically. And Indonesian customs head used the word tsunami of shipments coming in, right? And so how do we then manage all of this? Okay, so I thought I'd give you an idea of why and how customs impacts the seller and the buyer, right? Obviously, from the seller side, you may have customs risks many years after you export, as I mentioned. There are statute of limitations, right? If you are been sending something that is deemed to be a controlled or prohibited item, customs may black mark you, right? And if you are selling, of course, across countries, the duties will impact your own net profits, right? Because as I mentioned, if you're selling DDP, the customs duties in the other country will impact your net profit, right? So you need to be very careful that you're picking the right HS codes, right? To ensure that, you don't price your product wrongly, right? In the case of the import side, right? The main person in the B2C case is the receiver. They are actually responsible and liable under the law. I'm saying this under the law. Whether it's practical for customs to go after these guys, we haven't seen that to be the case, right? But obviously, if this person has been a particular individual, I give you an example, life case, in the UK, one individual has been buying face masks online and then selling them locally. and then ripping off people, under declaring. Customs has completely blacklisted this individual, and everything that this individual is buying now is being checked, right? Because Customs has the ability to do that. And of course, same thing like an export, all your imports, your risks of non-compliance will continue based on the local rules, right? Many years after you import. Okay, so how then do you address all these issues as a seller? What do you do, right? So here we've given you, and we'll share some of this presentation with you, right? We put a checklist here. I won't go through all of them, as to things that you should do before you start selling online. Ideally, what you want to do is to make sure that you've crossed the T's and dotted the I's of your supply chain, right? If this is a major market for you, you don't want to screw this up, right? So you want to make sure that you understand at least some of these requirements, and so you want to also make sure that you're doing this properly, right? So we've done a checklist, right? Because at the end of the day, I think that if you are able to proactively manage customs, right, it could be a differentiator, because what you're doing is you're securing access to your markets, right? For DHL, of course, we operate in 220 countries. My job actually is not so much to go give webinars, but it's more to lobby customs. We want 24/7. We want on site. We want lower inspection rates. Simplified clearance. All that, right? That's my main role. And of course, we have very strong partnerships with customs across the region. So, very quickly, just to finish off, right, what are some of the takeaways? There are opportunities to sell B2C channels. You've seen some of the discussions, and what Sarah has also mentioned, right? And we also see that for a lot of our customers who've been very, very successful, right? I actually think customs is a differentiator, right? It impacts you because it impacts your profit margins. It also impacts the customer experience. If it's bad customs clearance, things get delayed, customs goes after your importer, it causes a bad experience, right? Understand your role in the supply chain as a supplier selling DDP, right? Be familiar with the trade landscape, right? There could be some delays depending on the markets that you're selling to, so you should be aware of them. If duties and taxes are uncertain, factor in higher margins, right? Manage the issues proactively. I think that's very, very important, right? So with that, we of course can assist you if needed. We know to be a trusted trade advisor. With that, I end here and I will stop sharing. So thank you very much.